going to start today with the data extract, and my entire talk is going to focus on what happens in this one extract. It is from a video recording of a meeting at a neighborhood organization in a residential area of Tokyo. And this organization is responsible for such things as organizing neighborhood festivals and conducting fire prevention patrols. The researcher, it's me, has already set up the recording equipment, but the meeting itself has not started yet. At a prior meeting, I explained the research and I gained permission from most members of the organization to record, and they signed consent forms. But at this particular meeting, there will be a few people attending who have not heard of the research yet and haven't signed consent forms. So I prepared for this by bringing some extra consent forms, and this particular bit of interaction happens as one of these people comes into the meeting room. The researcher sees this person, realizes he hasn't signed a consent form yet, goes to retrieve a consent form, and then takes it to him. Okay. This is the meeting room. The interaction is, like I said, the interaction is occasioned by the entrance of this person over here, who I call Izumi, right? So he enters, the door is over here, so he enters and walks around to here, okay? You can see me, the researcher, I was over there, I walked here to get a consent form. The consent form's on the table there, okay? I call myself the researcher. I'll speak about myself in the third person. Hope that doesn't bother anybody. Okay. The other names on there are all pseudonyms, but roughly from left to right, we have Yamanaka, Washizu, the researcher, Koyama. Koyama is the new head of the organization, and this becomes relevant a little bit later on. Person I call Sekimoto, who has a very small part. Okay. Izumi and Harayama. There are a couple other people in there, but they don't talk, so I didn't give them any names. Okay. As I play the clip for you the first time, of course, it's in Japanese. If you don't understand Japanese, don't worry. I'll go through what happens, step by step in great detail. But as you watch it the first time, try to pay specifically attention to things like body movement and gaze, like where people are looking, how they're moving around, etc.
大学の研究でコミュニケーションビデオ撮るの？そうでその辺は悪用はしないから研究目的なんでどういう研究するの？それは大丈夫です古代日本人の古代からあるお疲れ様です。お疲れ様です。いや、最後違う。そうです。いや、今日の授業報告までそうじゃない。そうです。いや、はい。合ってる。大丈夫です。来月から加わりますから。いや、本当にそっちにいただかないと。この間の生も食べられた。
食べました。ちょっとお酢につけといて2日間かけて食べました。あれ甘酢につけちゃってもいいんですよ。
渡辺さん隣じゃなくていい。渡辺さん隣じゃなくていい。そこ。
Okay, so that's the data. Oh, by the way, there's a handout on the tables, which has a transcript, which could be quite a bit helpful as I go through this. But you don't need to look at the transcript quite yet, okay? Because even though Sylvia and Numa did a very good job with introducing the idea and some of the theoretical background, I'm going to go into a bit of theoretical background myself. But it'll be very brief because probably even more than Numa, I don't really like theoretical background, right? But anyway, basically, the distinction between competence and performance that is made within, for example, generative linguistics, and this is well known, and it goes back several decades. But of course, criticism of this distinction also goes back several decades. So for example, this person, Wooten, who is well known in ethnomethodology and CA, wrote this in 1975. And I'll just go ahead and read this quote. Sorry, wrong quote. Okay, so he says, acceptability is not just a question of producing sentences, which are comprehensible sentences in a language, but also of using expressions aptly in the light of, for example, social conventions. This in turn has led to an erosion, which is by no means complete or uncontroversial, of the distinction between competence and performance. So though he does not mention Himes in connection with this erosion, it's not hard to imagine that Wooten had in mind Himes' explication of communicative competence, which I'll go to next. And again, I'll read this quote. Within the social matrix in which it acquires a system of grammar, a child acquires also a system of its use regarding persons, places, purposes, other modes of communication, etc. All the components of communicative events, together with attitudes and beliefs regarding them. There are also developed patterns of sequential use of language in conversation, address, standard routines, and the like. In such acquisition resides the child's sociolinguistic competence, or more broadly, communicative competence, its ability to participate in a society as not only a speaking, but also a communicating member. So in Himes' concept of communicative competence, the distinction between competence and performance is eroded, as it involves knowledge of various aspects of how to participate in communicative events, but this erosion is again incomplete, as it is the individual who acquires and presumably brings this competence to each such event. Then jump forward 2 decades or so, and we still find people struggling with the incomplete erosion of the competence-performance distinction. So Jacobi and Ox, 1995, argue that to study language behavior, discourse, and social interaction, which some might call linguistic or communicative performance, is to study communicative competence, not as an abstract construct or model, but as it plays out in all its incredible complexity as people go about managing their identities, their relationships, and their lives. Okay. Now, of course, I have to mention Richard Young, so I take these 2 quotes from He and Young. And they discuss international competence, and they attribute this to Cramp's 1986. But they say that individuals do not acquire a general practice-independent communicative competence. Rather, they acquire a practice-specific interactional competence by participating with more experienced others in specific interactive practices. On the same page, in the same book, they also state that interactional competence is not an attribute of an individual participant, and thus we cannot say that an individual is interactionally competent. Rather, we talk of interactional competence as something that is jointly constructed by all participants. I think these 2 quotes from the same book, same page of the same book, are contradictory, right? It seems to me. So what is this concept of interactional competence that He and Young discuss? So is it different from Himes' concept of communicative competence? Does it involve the complete erosion of the competence-performance distinction mentioned by Wooten? One answer is that there's more of an emphasis on interaction and particular practices. However, this would already seem to be part of Himes' explication of communicative competence. Remember, Himes already talks about patterns of sequential use of language in conversation, address, standard routines, and the like, as well as ability to participate as a societal member. That was already part of communicative competence. And of course, Himes would have been familiar with the work of Shegloff and Sachs and Jefferson at UCLA. So it's not surprising that it's in there. Also, while they emphasize co-construction, Jacobi and Ox are also willing to continue using the term communicative competence in relation to the study of social interaction. A second answer is that communicative competence is conceptualized as a possession of the individual, something which different individuals bring to the interaction, but interactional competence is conceptualized as jointly constructed by all participants, as He and Young put it. However, again, there's a contradiction in their discussion of interactional competence, as they also state that they, that is, individuals, acquire a practice-specific interactional competence, which indicates that it is something acquired and possessed by individuals. So that's my theoretical background. I'm not going to talk about theory anymore, except just to say that the struggle to try to overcome the distinction between competence and performance goes on. and there's a growing body of work, especially in L2 interactional competence. But this conceptual distinction is still causing problems. And what I'm going to try to do today is I'm going to attempt to show how to adopt a conceptualization of interactional competence as totally and completely co-constructed in the interaction by participants. But I'm not going to be talking so much about interactional competence as interactional incompetence. Now, if you take Newman's term, intersubjective agency, I'm not sure how to make an opposite of that. So I'm going to stick with interactional incompetence. Okay, so now to return to the data. I'm going to show each part of the data bit by bit, and this is where the transcript will come in handy. As you see, like here, it says segment 1, 01 to 08. These are line numbers, so this is the part of the transcript that I'll be playing right now. So the extract begins as Izumi has just arrived and various people have greeted him. The researcher has also noticed his arrival and has moved to retrieve a consent form. So let me play this bit for you.
来てたかい？なんで？今風呂入ってこっからなんだよ。さっぱり自分家でもうあと寝るだけだよ。
So there is some quiet talk between Izumi and Harayama, which is not really picked up by the microphone. Izumi then turns away from Harayama and announces in a louder voice that he has just had a bath. Okay? Given that this is in the evening and the fact that Japanese typically don't go out after having a bath, this is possibly hearable as a complaint. What am I doing here? I just had a bath, right? This announcement, at the start of this announcement, it doesn't seem to be really addressed to anyone in particular, kind of just addressed to the room. But by the end of the announcement, Izumi and Yamanaka establish mutual gaze, and Izumi seems to be addressing Yamanaka. So it seems that the guy in sort of the green and blue, yellow jacket, and Izumi, they establish mutual eye contact by the end of the announcement. There is a brief exchange between these two about where Izumi had his bath, after which Izumi adds information that he was ready for bed. And of course, this adds to the hearability of this announcement as a complaint, right? So not only has he had his bath, but he's also was ready for bed. Then his wife or somebody said, "You have this meeting to go to," right? So then here he is. Okay. After this additional information, Yamanaka gazes back down, returning his attention to documents on the table, and Izumi shifts his gaze to middle distance. There are also some comments and laughter from Koyama in lines 2, 5, and 8, though these are not responded to. In participating in the interaction, Koyama shifts his gaze to Izumi and visually scans his body. He also turns his head towards Izumi and moves his left leg back so that his body is partially turned in Izumi's direction. However, as shown in frame 1, his body remains mostly oriented to the table. After his laughter in line 8, Koyama turns back toward the table. And also, during this brief interaction, the researcher retrieves a consent form and approaches Izumi. However, he doesn't try to enter the interaction, and while the interaction is still in process, he stops some distance from Izumi with his gaze averted. So we can see the researcher here, kind of looking down that way, not looking at Izumi, and he has stopped there and waiting for the interaction to finish. I'll play this for you again.
来てたかい？なんで？今風呂入ってこっからなんだよ。さっぱり自分家でもうあと寝るだけだよ。
And then one more time before I go on.
来てたかい？なんで？今風呂入ってこっからなんだよ。さっぱり自分家でもうあと寝るだけだよ。
Then after the talk related to Izumi's announcement ends, with Izumi, Yamanaka, and Koyama all disengaging from the interaction, the researcher resumes his approach toward Izumi. So let me play this for you. As he approaches Izumi, the researcher summons him by name. If you listen very closely, you can hear that he doesn't actually say Izumi-san. He says a different name. Again, this is a pseudonym, right? But as he approaches, the researcher summons him by name, prefaced with a formulaic apology, which is sumimasen, means excuse me, right? Izumi, who has been gazing down, responds by shifting his gaze to the researcher. The summons also attracts the attention of Koyama, though it is clear that he doesn't take himself to be the addressee. Rather, he turns to observe the researcher as he talks to Izumi. Koyama shifts his gaze to the researcher by rotating his entire body to his right. This involves rotating his lower body approximately 90 degrees, his upper body a bit more, as can be seen in the position of his shoulders in frame 5, and rotating his head approximately 180 degrees. So you can see here, Koyama turned to observe the researcher, right? In comparison with his bodily reorientation when he was interacting with Izumi a few seconds earlier, this reorientation to observe the researcher is somewhat greater. What the researcher says after the summons is quiet and unintelligible, but he then goes on to state in lines 11 and 12 that he is recording a video for university research, with this accompanied by a gesture toward one of the video cameras. The researcher uses a form of the verb toru, which means to take, to refer to the action of recording. Now for me, in English, take a video sounds weird. I would never say take a video, I would say record a video or something like that. But in Japanese, video toru is not an unusual expression. That's the usual way to say record a video. Okay? But toru also means take, so it's semantically broad and can be used to refer to a variety of actions, not just recording a video. Throughout, Izumi maintains his gaze on the researcher. As the researcher articulates desu, Koyama shifts his gaze slightly to Izumi. So let me play this for you again. Okay, one more time. Next, Izumi initiates repair on what the researcher has said. And this is really the interesting bit. Okay. Before beginning to articulate the repair initiation, Izumi turns his head and glances briefly at Koyama, and then turns it further to shift his gaze to Harayama. As he articulates the repair initiation, and specifically as he restarts it, he also moves his head forward and tilts it slightly to the right. One result of these head movements and gaze shifts is that the repair initiation is addressed to Harayama. Okay? In the terminology of Shegloff, Jefferson, and Sachs, 1977, this is a relatively strong repair initiation, in that Izumi also uses the verb toru, and specifically targets the object of this verb as a trouble source. So he doesn't say something like, what did he say? It's more like, what is he recording? Or what is he taking? Right, like that. So let me play this for you again. Okay. One more time. Now, one very important thing I want you to recognize here, to reiterate it, is that this repair initiation is not addressed to the researcher. He turns his head and addresses it to Harayama. Harayama, Koyama, and the researcher, though, all respond to the repair initiation. So Koyama's response is not picked up well by the microphone. He stops slightly before Harayama says communication, and then glances briefly at Harayama. With this glance to Harayama, together with the fact that the repair initiation was addressed to Harayama, Koyama seems to recognize that Harayama is responding to Izumi. It is therefore likely that Koyama doesn't actually complete his response. The researcher's response is also not picked up well, though he appears to laugh slightly and then looks at the camera as he continues. While Harayama is responding, Izumi averts his gaze and glances at the camera. As Harayama finishes, Izumi adopts middle gaze, not looking at anyone or anything in particular. Harayama's response to the repair initiation first treats the trouble as a hearing problem, as he states the object of the verb toru. He says video, right? Video. Okay? He goes on, though, to provide information about why the video is being recorded, treating the trouble as a problem of understanding the purpose of the recording. Let me play this for you again. Then I'm going to show you a different camera angle.
ビデオ、大学の研究でコミュニケーション。
Harayama's explanation can be understood following Goffman as the animation of words spoken on behalf of the researcher as the principle. So this is from the other camera. It's farther away, but the microphone is actually quite close to where they are. You can see Harayama in the kind of pinkish shirt there, and the researcher in the black shirt, and Izumi's head's kind of above the researcher's shoulder. This is hard to catch, but try to pay attention, especially to where Harayama looks.
ビデオ、大学で研究でコミュニケーション。
Let me try that again.
ビデオ、大学で研究でコミュニケーション。
So I don't know if you can catch this or not, but that he is animating words spoken on behalf of the researcher is especially clear as when Harayama finishes, he shifts his gaze to the researcher, right? As he says communication with slightly rising intonation, shifts his gaze to the researcher so that they establish mutual gaze, and he also nods once. And thus, he gives the researcher a chance to confirm the words spoken on his behalf. Then, as the repair work continues, Izumi states a candidate understanding. And meanwhile, the researcher confirms what Harayama has said. Okay. Izumi maintains his gaze to middle distance as he produces his candidate understanding, said with rising intonation. As he starts, both Koyama and the researcher shift their gaze to him, with the researcher also saying hi and nodding once, thus confirming the accuracy of Harayama's explanation. Koyama then confirms the candidate answer and nods, during which Izumi also nods a few times. Let's watch this again. Okay. Then, as it continues, Izumi now uses talk and gesture to make a joke about obscuring his face in the video. I haven't obscured Izumi's face in the video because I'm pretty sure this is a joke, right? So I don't take it as something as serious. Okay?
で、この辺は悪用はしないから研究目的なんで。
Okay. So Harayama starts to talk again in line 23, but stops as Izumi starts his joke. As he starts, he shifts his gaze to Koyama, and the two of them establish mutual gaze. While the researcher smiles, Koyama responds as the joke's addressee by laughing out loud. This becomes shared laughter as Izumi also starts to laugh, but the extent of the shared laughter between Izumi and Koyama is limited as Koyama disengages by looking down, then turns back to the table and starts to walk away. Izumi also seems to invite laughter from Harayama as he shifts his gaze back to him while continuing to laugh, but Harayama doesn't appear to join in, instead continuing with his explanation of the research. Through smiling, the researcher also participates in the shared laughter, but Izumi does not use gaze to invite the researcher to join. The researcher's participation in the laughter can thus be seen as peripheral. So let me play this for you again. Okay, after his joke and the laughter, and apparently ignoring Harayama, Izumi next sits down while addressing a next question to the researcher. So Izumi starts the question while he is in the process of sitting with his gaze down. However, he then restarts the question while shifting his gaze to the researcher, so that the researcher is clearly the addressee. This question with the stress on you, which means say, okay, can be heard as both a question and a comment on the research itself as unusual, possibly trivial. What kind of research are you doing? That sort of thing. Okay? The researcher does not respond by attempting to answer the question, and with his further laughter, Izumi does not treat an answer as missing. Instead, the researcher asks his own question about Izumi's willingness to be a participant. Parenthetically, it may be mentioned that an explanation of the research is on the consent form, right? So the consent form has two parts. The people sign the bottom part, and the researcher takes that and then leaves contact information and the explanation written in Japanese with the participant. So giving the consent form is also an answer to this particular question. And meanwhile, Koyama continues to walk away, though he does turn to look back from across the room. So I think this is very, very kind of neat. Here is Koyama. He's walked away, turns to look back, making sure everything's okay. Can I play that for you again?
どういう研究するの
Harayama, on the other hand, treats Izumi's question as calling for an answer and starts to provide one, though it's unclear exactly what sort of research he thinks the researcher is doing, right? If you look at the translation, he says something about looking at what Japanese have been doing since ancient times. And I don't know what kind of research he thinks I do, but anyway, maybe he's also making a joke.
古代日本人の古代からお疲れ様です。お疲れ様です。お疲れ様です。いや、最後、違う。そうです。いや、今日の授業報告までそうじゃない。違う。はい。合ってる。大丈夫です。来月から加わりますから。いや、本当にそっちにいただかないと、まあ、とりあえずこの間の生も食べられた。
食べました。ちょっとお酢につけといて、2日間かけて食べました。あれ、甘酢につけちゃってもいいですよ。
So as Harayama begins his answer to Izumi's question, the researcher moves closer to Izumi and places the consent form on the table. While this is happening, the former head of the organization, I call him Zen Kaicho. Zen Kaicho just means the former head of the organization. Right? Zen Kaicho enters, places a pair of slippers. The slippers are kept on a rack outside the entrance of the room, places them on the floor. Several people, including Harayama and the researcher, greet Zen Kaicho, and Harayama stops trying to answer the question. A new interaction, primarily between Harayama Koyama, who is, again, the current head of the organization, and Zen Kaicho starts about where Zen Kaicho should sit. This is a different interaction, and I haven't bothered transcribing this because it's very complicated, but it's also kind of interesting, so I'll talk a little bit about it. But there is some ambiguity about whether Zen Kaicho is now the former head of the organization or about to be the former head of the organization. And at the same time, whether Koyama is the current head of the organization or about to be the current head of the organization. So Koyama has already taken over some responsibilities as head. For example, he's organized this meeting. On the other hand, the formal transfer of power, if you will take place at this meeting, right? So it's still a bit ambiguous. And there's a certain place where the head of the organization always sits, which could be called the kamiza. They don't use that term, but this is what some students have told me they would call it, which is here. Okay? Apparently, this is a culturally recognized position based on where the entrance is and other things like that, right? So this is in the corner of the room. So when he comes in, you can see Zen Kaicho wants to sit way over there, right? Whereas Koyama and Harayama keep telling him, no, you got to sit over here. And I didn't continue this clip until the point where this happens, but eventually Zen Kaicho gives in and sits where he's been told to sit, right? Shows that power is and everything. Okay. So then that was all parenthetical. But while this different interaction is occurring, Izumi signs the consent form. Izumi then initiates a different interaction with Washizu, while the researcher detaches the bottom of the consent form. Finally, the researcher gives Izumi the other part of the consent form, adds a few more words of explanation, bows, and walks away. Okay. Now, I want to play the entire clip for you again, but let me make sure how much time I have the first 2 minutes. Okay, should be fine. So I'll play the entire clip for you one more time and then go into why I've described this in such detail. If I can find my cursor, there it is.
今風呂入ってこっからなんだよ。自分家でもうあと寝るだけだよ。何を言ってるんですか？大学の研究でコミュニケーション
ビデオ撮るの？
で、この辺は悪用はしないから研究目的なんで。
どういう研究するの？
それは大丈夫。古代日本人の古代からある。
お疲れ様です。お疲れ様です。お疲れ様です。
いや、最後、違う。今日の授業報告まで全然ない。はい。大丈夫です。来月から変わりますから。いやいや、本当にそっちいただかないと。
この間の生も食べられた？
食べました。ちょっとお酢につけといて、2日間かけて食べました。あれ、甘酢につけちゃってもいいんですよ。
渡部さん、隣じゃなくていい。渡部さん、隣じゃなくていい。そこ。今日だけです。今日最後です。
あれもらう。
Okay. Okay, so the point of going through the interaction in such detail, including features of participants' embodied behavior, is to show how Izumi, Koyama, Harayama, and the researcher collaborate to construct the researcher as interactionally incompetent. More specifically, the researcher is constructed as likely to need assistance, as unable to repair trouble in his talk, and as possibly even unable to understand a joke. This construction of the researcher as interactionally incompetent is not done out of malice. Okay? In fact, Harayama and Koyama are trying to be helpful. Nor is this done solely through talk. Okay? So first, with the researcher needing assistance and Koyama as responsible, one thing to note is that even before there is any sign of trouble, Koyama turns to observe the interaction between the researcher and Izumi. In fact, he shifts his attention to the interaction upon hearing the researcher's summons of Izumi. This shift of attention is not a hidden mental event. Rather, it is physically embodied and publicly visible. In addition, his observation of the interaction is not passing, as he continues to observe while the researcher starts to explain the video cameras, and when the researcher reaches a possible point of turn completion, shifts his gaze to Izumi to observe his response. Even after disengaging from the interaction and walking away, which he does once the repair work is complete, Koyama turns to observe again the interaction between the researcher and Izumi from across the room. In doing this, Koyama treats the researcher as possibly in need of assistance. In addition, as the new head of the organization, he bears some responsibility for what happens at the meeting, and specifically for allowing the meeting to be recorded. And his understanding of this responsibility is also publicly visible in his behavior. Then, looking at the researcher as unable to repair trouble, when someone initiates repair on talk addressed by another to him or herself in the prior turn, that is, when there is other initiation of repair in the next turn, then the default addressee of the repair initiation is the person who produced what is being targeted as a trouble source. So the researcher produced the trouble, Izumi initiates repair on it, the default addressee of that repair initiation should be the researcher. But when Izumi initiates repair on the researcher's talk, he uses gaze shift to address the repair initiation to Harayama. And this is not a subtle shift of gaze. It involves turning his gaze approximately 180 degrees, as well as moving his head toward Harayama. In addition, he does this even though he shows, through the relatively strong form of repair initiation, at least partial understanding of what the researcher has said. Though three people, including the researcher, respond to the repair initiation, as it is addressed to Harayama, it's Harayama's response that takes precedence. Both Koyama and the researcher, remaining on the periphery of the interaction between Izumi and Harayama, produce quiet responses and stop before Harayama finishes, though the researcher does confirm Harayama's explanation of the recording. As the repair work continues, the participation structure shifts as it is Koyama who confirms Izumi's candidate understanding. The researcher, however, remains on the periphery and doesn't attempt to answer. When Izumi tells his joke, one thing that is accomplished is to show that the repair work has been sufficient enough to continue. This state of affairs has been brought about by the contributions of Harayama and Koyama, but the researcher's attempted response to the repair initiation has not been treated as relevant. The researcher is thus constructed by all four participants through talk, gaze, and bodily position as unable to repair trouble in his own talk. And then when talking about the researcher is unable to understand a joke, so when Izumi tells his joke, he addresses it through gaze and bodily position to Koyama, who laughs in response. He then shifts his gaze to Harayama while laughing, though this does not seem to result in Harayama joining the laughter. Even though the researcher smiles in response to the joke, at no time does Izumi seem to invite him to join the laughter. So by doing this, Izumi seems to treat this as a kind of inside joke, something that Koyama and Harayama could get, but the researcher wouldn't get. Okay? Again, just like, say, Koyama's shift of attention, this inside joke treatment of the joke is something that's publicly visible, right? But then this only lasts for a few seconds. It's not that long. And eventually the researcher is brought back in from the periphery. And this happens as first Harayama, in completing the repair, explaining what the video recording is about, he shifts his gaze to the researcher looking for confirmation, and the researcher gives it. And then especially the researcher is brought back into the interaction as Izumi addresses this question to him, right? So then finally I have up here the manifestation of a language ideology. In CA work, the word ideology does not come up that often or at all. But I thought this was kind of interesting, so I decided to put it in here anyway. At no point do any of the participants attribute to the researcher limited competence to use Japanese. They never say stuff like, oh, his Japanese is not very good. Japanese would never say that in someone's presence. They might say it outside somewhere else to other people, but not in the person's presence. But through their embodied actions, talk, but also gaze, gesture, body positioning, they all, including the researcher, collaboratively construct the researcher as interactionally incompetent. It is tempting to see this as a manifestation of a common belief in Japan that Japanese is a particularly difficult language to master, especially as an L2. It is not unreasonable to describe this belief as a language ideology, and this belief persists in the face of a great deal of counter-evidence. There's a lot of counter-evidence that Japanese is not an especially difficult language any more than any other particular language, right? I don't want to argue that such a language ideology somehow lies behind what happens in this interaction. However, I would argue that through this interaction, the ideology is made manifest. So in countless other ways in different contexts, this ideology is made manifest. Like, for example, if someone is an L2 speaker of Japanese of very limited proficiency, they will still be praised very much for their ability to speak Japanese, right? Or I've heard people in Japan say stuff like, Japanese is not a very logical language. Unlike English. English is a very logical language. But Japanese is not a particularly logical language. Or there's a particular TV personality who's been on TV for several years now from Africa who apparently speaks intentionally garbled Japanese on TV. And his actual Japanese ability is quite better than would appear on TV, but he garbles it kind of intentionally. So those are all sort of ways that this ideology is made manifest. By looking at detail at one recorded manifestation of this ideology, it's possible to see, I think, not just how talk, but also various other semiotic modalities or resources are part of how the ideology is sort of brought to life. Now, this is my last slide. Do I have time? Yeah. Yes, wonderful. So I have, of course, only looked at one episode of interaction. I hope to have shown, though, how interactional incompetence, and by extension, interactional competence, can be conceptualized as completely constructed in and through the interaction. With such a conceptualization, L2 interactional competence becomes detached from any direct connection with proficiency. Someone with limited L2 proficiency can nevertheless be constructed as interactionally competent. And this is something which I have found through much of my research to be fairly common. I've argued many times in the past that, say, in a discussion task with L2 English users who are of fairly limited proficiency, that their interaction is nevertheless very sophisticated, and they do a really good job of it, right? But also someone with decades of experience of extensive L2 use I was trying to remember when I started studying Japanese, and I began studying Japanese when I was a university student. I graduated from university in 1988, so I probably started around 1986. So I now have 3 decades of Japanese experience, right? But even someone like me can nevertheless be constructed as interactionally incompetent. Now, with such a conceptualization of interactional competence, it doesn't make much sense to talk about the development of an individual's interactional competence over time. People do, though, change and hopefully improve in their ability to use an L2. So I would like to suggest that what develops over time are the resources. L2 resources, but also possibly other sorts of resources, such as new ways of positioning and moving the body. I learned to bow and do stuff like that by living in Japan. In part of this video, I do something which students have told me I shouldn't do, is that when I talk to Izumi, I did this, leaning on the chair. Very American, not very Japanese, okay? So I still have stuff to learn, okay? But these resources, to me, it's these resources that develop over time. Now, when an L2 learner participates in interaction using his or her L2, he or she participates in the construction of his or her L2 interactional competence. This is done through the use of various resources, not limited to specifically L2 linguistic resources. Some of these resources are brought to the interaction by the participants. Some of these resources emerge through the interaction, and some of these resources can be found in the local environment of the interaction. As the L2 learner gains new resources, how he or she participates in the construction of his or her L2 interactional competence can also change. Nevertheless, the individual L2 learner is never more than just one participant in this construction. And I'll finish with that.